Go for it.
Go for it.
The winter evening settles down, the bruised and beat up open sky, 6 o'clock. A city in its final dress, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves all about your feet. And then the ringing of a twitching hand, 6 o'clock, 6 o'clock. That's the new verse for that.
From the shadowed forest where druids whispered in verse, to the roaring stages of Finsbury Park and the Tree Arena, Ireland's poetic tradition has endured the grasp of conquest, colonisation, and time itself. In this video, we follow the lineage of the word, from Bardic courts and their sacred orders, through the fires of revolution and romantic nationalism,
and into the raw voice of doggerel, an evolution of that ancient tongue still beaten in modern rhythm.
When we hear the word bards today, it might conjure images from fantasy worlds, a lute player in Skyrim, or a wandering singer weaving tales in some medieval tavern. But in Ireland, the bard was far more than an entertainer. They were memory keepers of a people, the guardians of law, genealogy and learning. Their verses carried religion into ritual, their chants blessed warriors before battle, and their stories bound tribes to a shared history. Stretching back to Aurigin the poet, who delivered the first verses to Eru herself. In his historical memoirs of the Irish bards, Joseph Cooper Walker tried to simplify what was already a tangled web. He imagined the bardic tradition in Ireland as three great orders: the poets, the lawyers, and the historians. He called them the Filidhe, the Shonachie, the Brehons. The Filidhe, tracing its origins to the Celtic word velit, meaning to see, were poets who wove religion into verse and chanted before battle. To quote Cooper Walker, he writes, "They were constant attendants in the field of battle of the chiefs whom they served, marching at the head of their armies, arrayed in white flowing robes, their harps glittering in their hands. The Brehons stood as legislative bards who chanted the laws in a rhythm like the orators of Greece and Rome. They doubled up too as judges. Lastly, the Shonachie were genealogists, historians and keepers of ancient memory." Cooper Walker makes the claim that the most learned of the bards would join the order of the Druids, drawing a line in the sand between the two. However, many sources don't make it so simple. Medieval Irish law tracts like the Oro Ceacht Beach show us something more nuanced. It states there were 7 ranks of the Filidhe themselves, professional poets who could praise, satirise, preserve genealogies, and even recite law. But their roles didn't stop there. Irish literature contains a number of references to the raising of facial disfigurement through a bard's satire. One could even kill by such means. The Annals of Connacht record the death in 1414 AD of the Lord Lieutenant John Stanler from a bard's spell. Likewise, the Annals of Ulster recall how Cuan Lachan, the chief poet of Ireland, was killed in Tetba. Before dying, he was able to cause the bodies of his murderers to rot within an hour by means of a spell. But it gets even messier. In the book A Guide to Early Irish Law by Kelly Fergus, the role of the bards is expanded even further to include protection from sorcery, destructive powers and prophecy, overlapping with the Druids themselves. In the Irish annal Townbo Cullinge, Queen Maeve, en route to battle the Ulstermen, comes across a woman poet of Connacht. A prophecy is asked of her regarding Maeve's fate with the Ulstermen, speaking again to the mostly druidic role of prophecy. To confuse you even further, Pruntius McKenna, a Celtic scholar, marks their grouping as a threefold division: the Druids, the Filidhe and the Bards, all comprise in separate categories, like their counterparts in Gaul. In truth, the line between Bards and Filidhe, a possible subdivision of the Bards, is more messy than we'd care to admit, even overlapping with the Druids as time goes on. Still, Cooper Walker wasn't entirely wrong. His neat vision captures something vital. Poetry in Ireland, whether in the form of the Bard or the Filidhe, was never just entertainment. It was law, history, memory, and religion, all bound together in sacred verse. The power of the spoken word could forge destiny itself.
Before Christianization, Druids and Bards may have stood apart, but as the god of Rome spread, the lines between them blurred until they bled into one another.
When Christianity arrived in Ireland, the Druids didn't vanish overnight. Their ancient workings, law, memory, prophecy, and religion, found new guardians in the Filidhe, the learned doctors of verse. Celtic scholar Pontius McKenna puts it this way: the Druids bore the brunt of the church until they disappeared. The Filidhe, meanwhile, absorbed the roles of the Druids and succeeded in striking a remarkable compromise with the church, allowing both bodies separate but complementary spheres of authority. This wasn't an accidental handover, it was a reactionary step. Medieval law texts show the Filidhe organised, graded, and professional. The aforementioned 7th to 9th century Oruchiocht Biec, for example, lays out a hierarchy of poetic grades and shows that a Filidhe's education could last 7 to 10 years or more. Proof that the poetic class was structured, learned, and professional, and not a ragtag bag of wandering wizards. The title of Chief Poet of Ireland was recognised well into the 12th century. Families like the O'Daly and the O'Mail Cunora dynasties carried on the tradition for generations, serving as historians and memory keepers for Gaelic lore. Even in the 16th century, the Bardic schools were still alive and thriving. We know this because of manuscripts like the Sheafin Duanara. It was a collection of meticulous verses and commentary copied in these Bardic classes. One such manuscript was purchased by the Welsh philologist Edward Lloyd during his tour of Ireland, though it was already a century old at the time he purchased it. What's remarkable is that his book was modelled on master poet instructions dating back to the 13th century. Inside, students and scribes were drilled in strict poetic meters, in law, and in genealogy, carrying forward the entire memory of a people preserved in rhythm and verse. Former President of Ireland and linguist Dr. Douglas Hyde, in his book The Literary Tradition of Ireland, writes that the Bardic schools, which we know flourished as public institutions with scarcely a break from the Synod of Drumceat in 590 AD down to the 17th century, were really a continuation of the Druidic schools and embodied much that was purely pagan in their curricula. Hyde wasn't alone in this view. Edmund Campion, the Jesuit priest and writer, recorded during his visit to Ireland in 1569 that the students still attended their common schools of leechcraft and law. So, what exactly were these schools teaching, and who held authority within them? That's where things become tangled. The line between a bard and a Filidhe was never entirely clear. But the Celtic scholar Pontius McKenna offers some clarity. He explains, it was the Filidhe who absorbed the duties of both the bards and druids post-Christianization, keeping memory, law, and ritual alive in verse, and thus it was them who continued on with the schools. However, what we know for sure was that the bard or the Filidhe were no mere flute players in a medieval tavern. For 1,000 years after St. Patrick, he was still historian, judge, and satirist, the living archive of the old Gaelic order. And that's why, when the Tudor conquest and the 9 Years' War came crashing down, the bards and the Brehon law weren't just cultural casualties, they were seen as political threats. As the creeping shadow of the English crown stared down the Gael, one bard, Taig Dal O'Higgin, pleaded to the clans of Ireland to unite. His poem, from the Poem Book of the Gael from about 1555, laments as such. Why sit ye still, the clans of Valerius own? The clans of Con and Connor round you stand. Do ye not hear the troops of Saxon England march o'er your plains and trample down your land? Who puts his trust in England's perjured honour, unscathed by guile, unharmed by treachery? As waters rising 'neath the snows of winter, as hamlets flaming from one secret spark, so shall the chiefs of Erin rally around him when Brian's star arises on the dark. But O'Higgins' plea went unheeded. Within a generation, the 9 Years' War would rage across Ireland. It was one of the last great stands of the Gaelic order against Tudor England. When Hugh O'Neill, Red Hugh O'Donnell, and their Spanish comrades fell after the defeat at Kinsale in 1601, it wasn't just their armies that were defeated, it was a whole way of life. The Gaelic lords, who had once kept poets in their halls, who rewarded verse with land and cattle, were stripped of power and driven into exile. And with them went the lifeblood of the Bardic tradition. Without patrons, the schools closed, the poets scattered, and the ancient metres that had bound Ireland's law, memory, and history for millennia began to wither. In his local history work, Bardic Schools and the O'Dailies of Kilcrohan, Eugene Daly paints the fall of the Ireland's Bardic tradition in stark colours. The school, he writes, limped on after the Battle of Kinsale, but each year they grew weaker, shadows of their former glory. Following on from the likes of the Statute of Kilkenny in the 14th century, which combated the Gaelicization of the Anglo-Norman families, eyes were now set on Ireland's ancient Breton legal system, in particular by Sir John Davies, Attorney General of Ireland under King James I. He was the principal agent of its destruction in the early 1600s. His views were backed up by the Surveyor General of Ireland, Sir William Parsons, who wrote, "We must change their course of government, apparel, manner of holding land, language and habit of life. It will otherwise be impossible to set them up in obedience to the laws and to the empire." Their actions were celebrated by some of the earliest Munster colonialists, such as Edmund Spencer, who wrote in disgust at how the Breton system remained virtually uninterrupted. Then came the hammer blows.
7, 6, 11, 5, 9 and 20 miles today, 4, 11, 17, 32 the day before. Boost, 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 moving up and down again.
Cromwell's devastation in the 1640s and the crushing of the Jacobites in 1691. By the time the penal laws were enforced in the 18th century, Ireland's poets, once the keepers of law, memory and religion, had been reduced to outcasts, pariahs in their own land. The campaign to erase Gaelic culture wasn't just about law, it was about identity. To dismantle the Breton system meant dismantling the very people who kept it alive, the bards and the Filidhe. By the early 1600s, these hereditary poets, once honoured as living archives, were rebranded as agitators and rebels. Their satirical power, once feared even by kings, became intolerable to a crown determined to impose uniform obedience. But even as the Tudor and Stuart officials celebrated the civilising of Ireland, they underestimated the resilience of memory. The Bardic schools weakened and scattered, but didn't vanish in thin air. Manuscripts, oral traditions, and families like the O'Daily kept fragments alive in hidden corners of the island. In the 1873 book on the manners and customs of the ancient Irish, Dr. W.K. O'Sullivan recalls how these Irish books were buried to save them from crown authorities, even within his living memory. Though no longer supported by lords or clans, the bards and the Filidhe found new ways to carry forward the voice of Ireland, underground, a seed that would later sprout again in the hedge schools of the 18th century. Poets of the late 17th century Jacobite wars, though stripped of patrons, kept the old poetic metres alive, twisting them into songs of loss, exile and hope. Dahi O'Bruader, Owen Rua O'Sullivan, composed laments for fallen Gaelic lords. Sean Clarach MacDonald's lament, The Bonnie Prince Charles, is now most widely known in the form of the song Mo Gila Mar. As penal laws were chained upon Gaelic Ireland, Catholicism and its influences were beheaded. The Education Act of 1695 led to a reactionary movement of hedge schools. The hedge schools acted as a safe haven, a hiding place for both the underground Catholic Church and the Bardic schools. Although the name may imply the classes happened at a hedge, they were taught by itinerant teachers who travelled from place to place. The bards, who had a deep-rooted feel for Latin, if not Greek, according to Irish academic Daniel Corkery, became a helpmate of the church as teachers of the new generations of priests who were trained in their guise. Above all learning, the Gaelic traditions were first and foremost taught by the bards unto the priest, culminating in the priest of poetry such as Oliver Plunkett, Father Keating and Father Liam Ingles. Historian Antonia McManus reminds us that the hedge schoolmaster was heir to the bard and Brehon, a custodian of tradition. By the 18th and 19th century, the frenzy of romantic nationalism, spurred on by the Gaelic League, dived into the traditions that had soon readily been forgotten. In Ireland, in figures like Thomas Davis and Dr. Douglas Hyde, this movement drew directly from the well of bardic vitality. A nation's songs are as important as its laws, Thomas Davis would declare. The infamous W.B. Yeats emerged from this scene with his book The Celtic Twilight, to which he declared, "I would that we had in Ireland 1,000 bards, for our people are weary for lack of dreams." This merging of art and politics climaxed in 1916. Patrick Pearse, a poet, schoolteacher and revolutionary, explicitly cast himself in the bardic mould. He saw poets as not only singers, but lawgivers and warriors. Pearse wrote, "We seem to be back again in the bardic age, when a poet was not only the singer, but the lawgiver, the prophet, the patriot, and the warrior, and that the words of the bards come down the century to us, warm with living breath." In other words, the rising was not just fought with guns, but with poems. Yeats immortalised it in Easter 1916, declaring, "All changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born."
The poets of the Celtic revival not only revived myth and folklore, but they revived the ancient role of the poet as a shaper of nations.
As the millennia closed, the bardic tradition didn't reside in the halls of lords. It lived in the voices of ordinary people, carried through song, verse, and satire. Take Luke Kelly and the Dubliners. When he sang The Rising of the Moon, it wasn't just a folk ballad, it was the echo of the heroic tradition itself. Kelly was, in many ways, a modern filly, his voice the battle drum of Dublin's working class. Then came Phil Lynott and Tin Lizzy, fusing Ireland's myth with the swagger of blues and hard rock. Roisin Dubh, a love song to Ireland herself, was Phil's way of doing what the Romantic poets had done a century before, weaving mythical stories and rebellion into the sound of their age. Shane MacGowan and the Pogues pushed it further, with songs like The Sick Bed of Cuchulainn. His lyrics weren't polite ballads, they were biting, grotesque and hilarious. We hear echoes of courtside jesters and satirists. But the poetic tradition wasn't just in music. Brendan Behan put it on the stage, weaponizing theatre and song against authority. The L Triangle echoing still through the cobblestones, a ballad of tyrannical monotony, enlightening Irishmen in verse today as bards in courts of yore. And then there's Patrick Kavanagh, the poet who dragged Irish verse down from Yeats' liminality and planted it firmly in the parish field. Where Yeats wrapped Ireland in myth and mask, Kavanagh stripped it bare. He wrote of Raglan Road, the quiet hollows and the gossip of small towns. He proved that poetry didn't have to speak of gods and heroes. It could find beauty in the mud, in the mundane, in the ordinary life of rural Ireland. An age-old battle between beauty of the sacred and beauty of the mundane. The Irish music scene is exploding on the world stage like none before. Paddy Casey, Bell X1 and the Coronas all had their place in the last 20 years. But in the 2020s, it's Fontaines D.C. who has knocked down the door, with none other than Kavanagh's verses and McGowan's nonchalance, charged with mundane and vitalist energy of Eru herself. They host a whole clan riding their wave, from the Gurriers and Kneecap to the Merry Wallopers and Inhaler. But it is them, I make the claim, who are the symbols of that ever so alive Bardic tradition. Bursting onto the scene with their debut album Doggerel in 2019, Fontaines, charged with the vitalistic energy of Dublin's liberties, summoned the spirit of Patrick Kavanagh himself, showing us what it was like to live in Dublin through a poet's eye.
Well, we're all into people like Yeats and Patrick Kavanagh, where Curly's from. Curly likes Patrick Kavanagh a lot. He got a book by Patrick Kavanagh for Christmas, didn't he?
Yeah, I did actually get it for Christmas off my girlfriend, and yeah, Patrick Kavanagh would probably be the biggest one for me because I enjoy his flaws in like his earlier stuff, and then like whenever you see his progression through his poetry, and then you end up on Raglan Road, which is ended up being a song that the Dubliners started singing.
The closing track of the album is Dublin City Sky, a poignant lament for an echoing Dublin past that seems oh so far away.
License anymore, in my view, to describe the streets of Dublin, you know, because every time I come back to Dublin, the streets look completely fucking different, you know.
Another track, The Lots, refers to the ever-expanding grasp of sheer materialism enveloping Dublin, from architecture to ideas. Death is falling down on your work routine, and it's fallen even harder on your churches and your queens. Green Chan, the lead singer, bewails. As a Dubliner myself, there was something about this album that stirred unconscious awareness of my surroundings, a poet's awakening of the bittersweet, mundane balance between my actual surroundings and my heroic, idealist view of Ireland. In 2022, Skinty Fia marks a significant evolution in their sound and thematic exploration. The title, derived from an Old Irish phrase meaning the damnation of the dare, reflects the band's deepening engagement with Irish identity and the complexities of their relationship with their homeland from more of an expatriate mindset, just like the 16th century bard Tadhg O'Higgins' plea for conscious awareness of identity-shattering events. Skinty Fia's I Love You highlights the despicable behaviour of an establishment so disconnected from the results of their actions. In particular, the actions of the church, such as the Magdalen Laundries, and their shielding from justice by the Irish political elite. Fontaines D.C, although with a distant fondness of Irish heroism traversed by Yeats and Pearse, prefer the exploration of mundane themes to in which the day-to-day beauty can be found. Nonetheless, Fontaines, like Kavanagh before, are recipients of the cultural milieu that extends back to the line of Druids themselves, and that line is unbroken. People mistake traditionalism for conservatism, but real tradition only lasts whilst it's looking forward.
Traditionalism is not the preservation of a certain period in time, but it's the recognition of the eternal presence of eternal truths.
The Irish poetic tradition survives only because every generation has found its own voice to carry it forward. And today, Fontaines D.C. are the fuel for that eternal flame.